Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us today for Opera Talk. Turn it over to you, Jeffrey.
Good afternoon and welcome to Beethoven's Fidelio. Well, that's the beginning of the Fidelio Overture, and we're going to enter into a rather confusing world of overtures. There are 4 overtures for this opera. The last was the Fidelio Overture, it dates from 1814, which would be the second revision of the opera by Beethoven. And prior to that, there were 3 Leonore overtures. And it made me think of Rossini, who actually wrote one overture that was used for 3 different operas. And you go back to 1813 and you have an opera called Oeuvre in Palmira, and he used one overture for that. Then 2 years later, in 1815, another opera, Elizabeth, Queen of England, he used the same overture. And then in 1816, he used the overture for an opera which actually we're going to be doing in May, which is The Barber of Seville. And today it's known as the Barber of Seville Overture, though melodically it has absolutely no connection to that opera whatsoever because it wasn't meant for that opera. So you might wonder, well, why did Rossini do this? The first opera, Aureliano, was produced in La Scala, Milano, northern Italy. The second opera, Elisabetta, was performed in Naples, southern Italy. And then Barber of Seville was performed in Rome. So Rossini was thinking, well, what are the chances of someone from Naples hearing the opera at La Scala? Very few. I could just use the overture, which is a good overture, and use it for my second opera. And then the same thing will happen with Rome, which is a certain distance from Naples, and he didn't have to worry about people in Naples going to Rome to hear the opera. And so you have that reason, plus Rossini at this point was very, very busy, was highly prolific as an opera composer, and would be so until the age of 37, when he stopped writing operas. And sometimes he was in a hurry. He would fall behind schedule. So why not take an overture that maybe was forgotten, belonged to an opera that wasn't as successful, or hadn't been heard in a certain part of Italy? So that's the case for Rossini. Beethoven, little different situation with 4 overtures for the one opera. It had to do with the fact that Fidelio, when it was first produced, was not a success. And there would have to be a revision and then a second revision, so that the original overture for the opera was Leonore Overture number 2. Then 5 months later, in 1806, you had this first revision, and he uses the Leonore Overture number 3, a reworking of the same materials, much better overture than number 2. And then for the revision in 1814, and the opera is being called now Fidelio, he's going to write an independent overture, which is now known as the Fidelio Overture. Of course, I've left out one, which is Leonore number 1. Apparently, that was written for a projected production of Fidelio in Prague in 1807, but the opera was never produced, so the overture wasn't heard. To add to the confusion, for the second revision of Fidelio in 1814, Beethoven hadn't finished the Fidelio Overture. He couldn't use it. So there's speculation that he might have used Leonore number 1, though few people think that was the case. The librettist who was involved in the revision for 1814, Georg Treitsky, says in his memoirs that Beethoven used his overture for the ballet The Creatures of Prometheus. And then there's some speculation that the overture to the Ruins of Athens, incidental music, was actually used for the first performance. The second performance got the overture that you just heard for about 3 seconds. Very confusing. So Beethoven wrote one opera. I actually yesterday had somebody who told me he wrote 2 operas, but he was counting a revision when revision doesn't count as a whole entity, as a new opera. Think back to Madame Butterfly. The first performance of Madame Butterfly was a failure. Puccini had to drastically reduce the opera, but it was still Madame Butterfly and was produced a half year later to great success. In case of Fidelio, of course, there'll be 2 revisions. So he only wrote one opera, and you have a sort of a select group of very important composers who wrote only one or none in case of operas. You have Robert Schumann, who only wrote one opera, Genoveva, which was not a great success, and you rarely hear it today. Franz Liszt wrote one opera. That was at the age of 13. And it was produced at l'Opéra in Paris, got 4 performances, and then that was the end of it. Not a great opera. I had heard or read recently that a second opera by Liszt was discovered. I never followed up on it. I don't know if it was published, if it was performed or recorded, so I stick with the one opera. Chopin, of course, didn't write any operas. He focused on piano music. That doesn't mean he didn't like opera. He loved the music of Bellini, and he would attend the opera, even go to Meyerbeer's opera, which really doesn't gel very well with Chopin, who liked sort of quiet, gentle music, which is called bel canto. Oh, we have Bruckner, Mahler, didn't write operas. Now, in the case of Mahler, he almost wrote an opera, or he wrote parts of an opera. Carl Maria von Weber, towards the end of his life, was working on an opera called Die Drei Pintos, and he never finished it because of other commitments, and also because he died young at the age of 40 of tuberculosis. And during the 1880s, a grandson, Carl, contacted Mahler and asked him if he could finish Die Drei Pintos. What remained of it were some 7 sketches for individual numbers, or arias or choruses or whatever, out of a total of 17. And those 7 belonged to Act 1. So Mahler, in fact, had to write an entire act on his own, trying to stay in the Weber style. And this will be produced in 1888. Haven't heard much about it since, though there is a recording of it. But that's the closest he came, and he probably would have done very well with opera. Think of the great songs he wrote, and even used vocal music in some of his symphonies. And don't forget, he was one of the great opera conductors of his day. The 10 years at the Hofoper in Vienna, from 1897 till 1907, are considered the golden years. But he tended to stick with instrumental music. Oh, back to Beethoven. I did leave out Brahms, sorry, who didn't write any operas. But you should keep in mind that he wanted to write an opera, and it was for a lack of a good libretto that he probably didn't produce one. But Brahms also comes the second half of the 19th century, where you have Richard Wagner dominating the operatic stage. And there may have been a part of him that didn't want to sort of interfere with Wagner's world, sort of the operatic world. He didn't want to have anything to do with music of the future, new music, because Brahms was a classicist, a traditionalist. When it came to instrumental music, he wanted to be the dominant composer of the day, which he was. But opera, he was willing to give opera to Wagner. But in any case, he never wrote an opera, but wrote some very fine vocal music, from songs to choruses. So now, back to Beethoven. And writing an opera for Beethoven was very important, as it would be for any composer of the day. You wrote an opera, you got it produced, it was successful, and your reputation was assured. Now, Beethoven was well aware of this, because even after Fidelio and not having success with it initially, he was thinking of other operatic projects. But to give you an example, if we go to France, two composers, Hector Berlioz, who understood very quickly in his mid-20s that if he would get an opera produced at l'Opéra, this would guarantee instant fame. And then the doors to l'Opéra would be open to him for the rest of his life. This would happen to a composer named Halévy, who wrote La Juive in 1835. Huge success. But this was after about a dozen other operas that he wrote. Not grand operas, most of them were opera comique, meaning operas with an alternation of dialogue and music. But this opera was so successful that the doors were open to him till his death in 1862 to l'Opéra, despite the fact that very little what he produced afterwards, there were well over 20 operas, was really very good, but the doors remained open to him. Berlioz, the doors remained closed to him for the rest of his career because of one failure, his Benvenuto Cellini of 1838, which only got 4 performances, fiasco, and he was never allowed to have an opera produced again at l'Opéra. So I guess it would be a risky move for a composer, but it was the way to go to enhance your reputation, because at this point, when Beethoven composes Fidelio, he's already a very well-known figure. He hasn't attained universal popularity yet. This will happen at the time of the second revision, but he was still a well-known quantity. And this would have only enhanced his reputation. So he is thinking of writing an opera, and he's approached by someone we've come across before several times when discussing Die Zauberflöte, or the Magic Flute of Mozart. And that's Emanuel Schikaneder. Wonderful name. He's born in 1751, dies in 1812. He was pretty much your artistic everyman. He was an actor, he was a singer, he was a playwright, he was a composer, he was a librettist, stage director, theater manager, you name it, he did it. And he took over a theater in 1788 just outside of Vienna called the Theater auf der Wieden. And this became a very popular place for light opera. And having met Mozart previously, he commissions him to write an opera which will be Zauberflöte. And he will be the librettist, even creates his own role for himself, Papageno, he's the first one. And the opera is produced in 1791, and it's a smash, huge hit. Sadly, Mozart couldn't enjoy a lot of it because he would die by the end of 1791. So Schikaneder would continue to work with this theater until June 12th of 1801, when he shuts it down and he takes over a new theater called the Theater an der Wien, which still functions today and will become a very important theater in the musical life of Vienna. And he's sort of in and out of the theater. At one point he's the theater director, another he's just a stage director. But when he takes over being theater manager, in 1803, he approaches Beethoven and says, let's collaborate on an opera. And gives him a libretto. It was called Vestas Feuer. This is Vestal Fever. And it had to do with some plot in ancient Rome. And as was customary, a composer who was to write an opera for a theater would have an apartment in the theater. So Beethoven would move into the Theater an der Wien. Beethoven was famous for changing residences. Almost every other month he was someplace else. But here he stayed for an extended period of time working on this libretto, not feeling very much in common with it, and eventually drops it. There is a large fragment of it that apparently is in the music library of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, very important music society in Vienna. But that's the last we'll hear of that. And so he'll move out of the theater. He'll move into an apartment. It was a top floor belonging to a baron. And that apartment will be his most frequented residence. He'll still be switching around, but often come back to this place. Had apparently a very nice view from that top floor. And nothing's going to happen until in 1804, Schikaneder decides to leave the Theater an der Wien, and replacing him is the Baron Peter. Oh, there goes my memory. Peter von Braun. That's A-U-N, not O-W-N. And he was responsible for introducing the silk industry to Austria. And because of this, he was made a baron in 1795. The year before, in 94, he's going to be put in charge of two theaters. These will be imperial theaters. One is the Burg Theater, dating back to the mid-18th century, and the other the Kärntnertor Theater, which is impossible to pronounce. And they're going to give him a third theater, which will be the Theater an der Wien, for him to manage in 1804. And he wants to bring back Beethoven to produce an opera. Now, named as secretary of the opera is a good friend of Beethoven's, Joseph von Sonnenleitner. And he had a good position at court. He was also a poet, a librettist. And he suggests to Beethoven a French libretto by Jean-Nicolas Bouilly entitled Léonore ou l'amour conjugal. I think that translates itself. And Beethoven's intrigued with this scenario. You're going to have Sonnenleitner translated from the French to German. And he was also an opera librettist. He would write 7 libretti, including one for Luigi Cherubini for an opera to be produced, Faniska, in Vienna, but of course in the German version. And so Beethoven moves back into theater just for a short while. Then he goes back to his top floor apartment. And he's going to work most of 1804 and much of 1805 on this libretto. So it is going to be completed, and the premiere will take place on November 20th of 1805. Only gets 5 performances, not a success. In part because of the libretto. It was too long. It was 3 acts instead of 2 acts. The first act apparently was very slow. Nothing happens in the first act. And then there were some political reasons. Napoleon had his troops march into Vienna on November 14th of 1805, and he followed a couple days later and set himself up in the palace of Schönbrunn. Now, Beethoven's supporters and friends were mainly of the upper classes, the aristocracy. One of the most important was Prince Lobkowitz. They all fled the city. They went to their country homes. So his regular audience wasn't there. The audience that did attend didn't want to attend an opera about freedom because they just lost their freedom. So this was an utter disaster. Well, the friends of Beethoven decided that the music was too good to be discarded, that he should do a revision of it. And the revision will take place on March 29th of 1806. And he's going to use another friend of his by the name of von Breuning to condense it into 2 acts, make a little more sense out of it. But this only gets 2 performances, another failure. This time, this was more attributed to the very poor orchestral playing. In fact, Beethoven said, "They're murdering my music." That's his quote. So the opera is going to be cast aside, left like in a fallow field for 6 years. And it's during this period that Beethoven is going to think about some other operatic projects. Playwrights of the day are very eager to collaborate with him. And part of this is going to be happening after 1813. That's the year, and we did a program on this a couple of years ago, where he gave this crazy concert. It was the premiere of the 7th Symphony and also the Battle Symphony, Wellington's Victory. The 7th Symphony, which is such a great work, was a mild success. The huge success of the evening was Wellington's Victory, which is considered not a very good piece of music, but it did entail a big battle scene with cannons and muskets, and of course the public loved that. So at this point, he was an extremely popular composer, and there was a good chance that uh, another revision of Fidelio would be successful. But prior to it, uh, there are thoughts of doing operas based on play The Ruins of Athens. Actually, he'd written incidental music to it. There's something called The Ruins of Babylon, a version of Macbeth. But in 1814, we get three singers who were connected to the Imperial Opera, and they thought that for their benefit concert, it'd be a good idea to remount Fidelio, but in a revised form. And for this, he's going to use another librettist, who will be Georg Treitsky, excuse me, who also was an official at court and was a playwright and translator. And he's going to form the opera into the way it is today, that we would hear it, and again in two acts. Beethoven virtually changes every number in the opera in some way or another, except just for one. But he does struggle. I should actually go back to 1805 to the original Fidelio, where Beethoven greatly struggled with the composition of the music, as he did with all of his music. This wasn't a Mozart or a Schubert who could compose an entire work in their heads and then put it on paper right away, and it was as good as it was. It would stay that way. Beethoven would rework and rework. For instance, the beginning of the Fifth Symphony took something like 15 different versions just to arrive at ba-ba-ba-bam. In Fidelio, there's a great aria by the main male character, Florestan, at the beginning of, Act 2, Scene 1. And he did some 18 versions of the opening of that aria. And then there's the final duet for Florestan and Leonore, or Fidelio. And there are 10 versions of that. And others went through multiple versions. But anyway, in 1814, Treitsky and Beethoven come up with a good version of it, and now it's a big success. And Carl Maria von Weber, this is going to be in May of 1814. Weber is going to conduct a performance in Prague in November, and Weber was also a very important early conductor. And then it's going to travel all over the German states. And then by 1839, the year that it comes to America for the first time, it was one of the most popular operas in the German repertory. Comes to the Met in 1884, which would be its second season. And from 1884 till 1987, it'll have 153 performances over the course of 35 seasons, which makes it a repertory opera, but not one of the most popular when you think that during that same period, Aida had 651 performances. Now, Fidelio is what we call a rescue opera. Why a rescue? Well, because there's a rescue in it. And rescue opera, it wasn't a very important species or genre of opera. I mean, opera, you've got opera seria, which is grand opera. You have opera comique, which I mentioned before, is lighter fare. It's not funny. It's not comic opera, but it is the combination of dialogue with music. Or you have opera buffa, which is comic opera. Rescue opera, it's been referred to as a subspecies of opera. And it doesn't last very long. One of the early examples is 1784, when we have a Belgian-born composer by the name of André Grétry, who settles in Paris in his mid-20s. He's born in 1741, and will produce some 66 operas. He'd already written a few before that, but in total there's 66. And one was Richard the Lionhearted, which is premiered in 1784. And if you still remember some of your social studies English history, you remember that Richard the Lionhearted was more out of England than in England, and in one instance he was captured and imprisoned, and the only way he could be released was if the English paid a huge ransom, which they did. So that's what the opera's about. So it's a rescue opera. Richard the Lionhearted is rescued. We're going to have a couple more, particularly written by one Luigi Cherubini. There's Lodoiska of 1791, which is his first great operatic success. And then in 1800, Les Deux Journées, a second one. In Lodoiska, you have a young woman who is captured and imprisoned in a castle. The castle is burnt down. Fortunately, she's not in it when it happens. And so, well, she's rescued. Now, these rescue operas have as a theme, or themes, of course, the rescue due to the abduction of a woman or the imprisonment of someone for unjust reasons, or because of natural disasters, so that somebody suffers the consequences of an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. And again, these were popular for a very short period of time. By the early 19th century, we're into a different form of opera. But Cherubini would have a tremendous impact on Beethoven because of this type of opera, the rescue operas. Now, we dealt with Cherubini in the fall of 2022, when we did his opera Médée. And it was the first time that the Met was offering Médée. I believe it was the opening opera of the season, which is extraordinary. This was his most popular work, his most famous work, and it hadn't been heard at the Met and had been in existence since 1797. And I would like to talk a little bit about him because he did have such a profound influence on Beethoven. And it's rather a strange story, Cherubini. In his day, he was considered the greatest composer alive. And oh, how the mighty have fallen. After his death, he's born in 1760, dies in 1842, his reputation went with him. And it's sad because he was extremely competent, very skillful, and greatly admired by the top composers of the day, including Beethoven. Schumann had great admiration for him. Mendelssohn had great admiration for him. Mendelssohn, who met him twice. When he was 16, his father took him to Paris, and at that point met Cherubini, who at this point was the director of the Conservatoire. And he was so impressed with young Mendelssohn, who was this stupendous prodigy. Don't forget, Mendelssohn will go on to become not only a very fine composer, I'd like to call him a great composer, but maybe I'm going too far, but he would become one of the great conductors of the day, the greatest organist in Europe, a very talented artist, an excellent violinist, an excellent violist, and he was one of the great pianists of the day. There was nothing he couldn't do at a just unbelievable level. And even as a youngster, keep in mind that he wrote his octet when he was 16, which is now one of the staples of the chamber music repertory, and at age 17 wrote a Midsummer Night's Dream overture, which is a work of genius. And no other composer in history, and I'm not going out on a limb with this, wrote a masterpiece on the level of the octet or the Midsummer Night's Dream at that young an age. Mozart, the great works come later, not at age 16 and 17. Now, Mendelssohn, as I said, would meet Cherubini, who was so impressed with him, he wanted him to stay and become a student at the Conservatoire, was turned down by Mendelssohn. He did make a comment, not to Cherubini's face, that Cherubini was an extinct volcano. And I presume this was not meant that his music was bad. It's just at that point in his career, he was no longer having success with operas. He was writing some sacred music and wrote he wrote two very fine requiems. He even wrote 6 string quartets during the 1830s, but again, not very important music. But his career was basically over, except he was the director of the Conservatoire for 20 years and left a very serious imprint on it, turned it into the best conservatory in Europe, to the point that all conservatories in Europe were being modeled on his, despite the fact that he was extremely conservative, very depressed, and rather grumpy. Now, I should mention that he was having great success during the 1790s, as long as you had the royal family in power, and then the provisional government. He was a royalist, but he had to keep these sympathies quiet, otherwise you know what. But in 1799, we have a coup d'etat by Napoleon, and he pronounces himself Premier Consul. And Napoleon considered himself a great judge of art, whether it be painting or sculpture or music. And he literally controlled what opera composers could produce which operas in Paris. Maybe this is an aspect of Napoleon you're not aware of. And he didn't like Cherubini because he was this grumpy old man, and he didn't like his music. He thought it was too noisy. So there is this encounter. It might be apocryphal, but I don't believe so. There was an encounter between Napoleon and Cherubini. There were many, but this is one of them, where Cherubini had been pretty much banned from the opera stage of l'opéra. And Napoleon would say, "You have great talent, citoyen Cherubini, but your music is too loud. Let us talk of Paisiello's, which lulls me gently." Whereupon Cherubini, who was known to have a rather tart tongue, "I understand perfectly, citoyen Consul. You prefer music that does not prevent you from dreaming of affairs of state." That didn't go over too well. And there's only going to be a reconciliation when Cherubini makes a trip to Vienna in 1805. This following a season of Cherubini operas, some of them rescue operas, that was given in Vienna in 1802. And he's going to coincide with Napoleon. In fact, Cherubini is going to attend the premiere of Fidelio and will meet Beethoven. And at this point, Beethoven proclaimed Cherubini as the greatest composer of opera alive. 12 years later, he'll go even further and say he's the greatest composer alive, that coming from the greatest composer alive. It's quite a compliment. But when he is in Vienna, he is summoned to Schönbrunn to see Napoleon, who wants him to organize a series of concerts, which he does, and very well. And then Napoleon asks him to return to France as soon as he can, because he wants him at court. Unfortunately, he doesn't wind up staying in Paris. He goes to a Chateau de Chimay, which is on the Belgian border, and sinks into this terrible depression, gives up music, builds a herbarium, also is studying botany and studying painting, until he's requested to write a mass for a local church, which goes very well, and he decides to go back to music, but sacred music. And he does write a few more operas, but they're not at all successful, thus Extinct Volcano. And with the return of the Bourbons in 1814, and we have Louis XVIII, he's restored in terms of reputation. He's given many honors, and that's when he'll be appointed eventually, 1822, the new director of the Conservatoire. Now, one oddity, Mendelssohn, who thought the world of Cherubini's music, referred to an overture of his, and I'm just going to play you the beginning. He refers to the three opening measures, and I'll play it to you, and then I'll read you the quote of Mendelssohn, which is quite surprising. Those are just three measures. Of them, Mendelssohn said, the first three bars of the overtures, as Les Deux Journées, are worth more than our entire repertory. He puts this above everything. I don't see what the big whoop is here. I wonder what he was smoking that morning. And anyway, interesting quote from a great musician, so maybe he heard something that we don't hear. So all this to say that we do have this meeting between Beethoven and Cherubini. It'll be at the house of Josef von Sonnleithner, and Cherubini had attended that performance of Fidelio, and the only thing we have on record that he said about it, and again he had a rather tart tongue, is that he couldn't determine what key the overture was in. And then Beethoven would play piano at the soirée, and Beethoven was one of the great pianists of the day, and Cherubini criticized him. Again, he's a strange figure. But later on, he would become a great promoter of Beethoven's music in France and would admire him. And as I said, Beethoven held him in great, great esteem. So we have Cherubini Rescue Opera, and that's going to have a great impact on the plot of Fidelio, which I'll go through very, very briefly because I want to get to something else. So Sonnleithner, even though he had a position at court, still had to get by the censors with this translation of the Bouilly libretto. And we're coming off of the French Revolution. All the kingdoms, all the imperial courts are very nervous about revolution. And this is an opera that deals with freedom and human rights, etc. It's very close to the revolutionary subject. And so you had to be very careful what you would set to music or you would produce as a play. In terms of censorship, think of the Masked Ball of Verdi of 1857. Originally, it was supposed to be about the assassination of Gustav III, the King of Sweden. But the Austrians, at this point, which were owning northern Italy, were having a great say as to what type of subjects you could put on stage. And Verdi couldn't get past the censors because it dealt with the death of a king, or the murder of a king. So he had to change the scenario, so it took place in Massachusetts, and instead we have a governor instead of a king. So what if you knock off a governor of Massachusetts? That doesn't mean anything. So the opera would be produced that way. Now we've gone back to the original, I believe, even at the Met. But you're going to have Beethoven and Sonnleithner having to deal with the same problem. So the censor says it's all right as long as it takes place in another country and in a different time. So this is early 18th century, and it takes place in Spain. And we're at a state prison. And in the prison, we have a character named Florestan, who previous to the beginning of the opera, 2 years before, had been imprisoned by his enemy Pizarro, who's the governor of the prison. Apparently, Florestan had disparaged him publicly, and so he was arrested and thrown into a dungeon really at the bottom of the pit. And he's assumed to be dead. His wife, Leonora, is convinced he is not dead. And she puts together this plan to disguise herself as a young man, Fidelio, to go to the prison and find out if he's still alive. So the first scene of Act 1 is pretty much an introductory scene. We're introduced to Fidelio. We have the head jailer by the name of Rocco. Rocco has a daughter, Marcellina, who's very pretty, very pert, and she is loved by another assistant, Giacchino. Unfortunately, she's not in love with Giacchino, who's trying to persuade her to marry him. She's in love with Fidelio, unbeknownst to her that, of course, Fidelio is Leonora. And Leonora can't be concerned with all this. She's trying to gain the trust of Rocco so she can go along with him on his rounds and possibly find her husband. In the second act, we meet Pizarro. He's a nasty piece of work. He's reviewing his troops. He's expecting a visit from the prime minister or the governor. It depends on which scenario you read. And he's placed a trumpeter on a tower to warn him of the arrival of the governor, because he wants to kill Florestan so that he doesn't get into trouble. So he approaches Rocco and says, I want you to do the deed. Rocco is a decent person, says, I will not do that. So they come to an agreement that Rocco will build a grave, or dig a grave, and Pizarro will carry out the murder. So this is overheard by Leonora, and she descends into the depths of the prison with Rocco, discovers Florestan, gives him water and bread. Arrives Pizarro and pulls out a dagger ready to kill him, whereupon Leonora pulls out a pistol and says, "Don't you dare." And then we hear this trumpet call. And the governor has arrived a little bit early. And so everybody goes up. Florestan, of course, is saved. There's a huge crowd in the courtyard or parade grounds come to greet the governor. The prisoners are even let out for the occasion. And the governor or prime minister recognizes Florestan, his old friend. Pizarro is immediately arrested, and the opera ends on a very happy note, final joyous chorus. So I could play you an excerpt or two from the opera, which I did 5 years ago, but I thought of doing something a little bit different, and this is a bit risky, but I'm going to attempt it. I'm going to play you half of the Leonore Overture No. 3, which is a great piece. Often as just a concert piece, stands on its own. And then I'm going to play you a spoof, hi Sarah, that is based on the overture. Now, the spoof is very amusing, but the problem is, and Leonard Bernstein talks about this in one of his young people's concerts, that the moment you start to explain humor, well, it doesn't become very humorous anymore. But I have tried this out on 2 other audiences, and they really enjoyed it and they got it, because I did provide a list of things to listen for. So I should anyway stop talking. I'm going to first play you the Leonore Overture No. 3 as Beethoven wrote it. Then I'll do a little explaining, and then I'll play you the spoof. This is Georg Schulte and Chicago Symphony, very fine recording. The one thing I'll point out, and then I'll repeat it later, is that the overture begins with this great fortissimo chord, and then you have this decrescendo, and you get to a piano level, very quiet. Hoffnung, who is the author of the spoof, does something with this beginning which is very amusing, but I want you to notice the original. Fortissimo, decrescendo, very soft piano, and you stay there. And of course, listen for the trumpet solo. It comes way, way into the piece. So you saw how long it took us to get to the trumpet. That's over 7 minutes. So we come to the so-called spoof. This is by an Englishman with a very German name. I think his origins were German. Gerard Hoffnung. Maybe you've heard of him. You may recall there was a PDQ Bach, a fictional composer put together by Peter Schickele. And he was very popular. He would give concerts. I attended a couple of them. Very funny. Would do potpourris using the music of 20 different composers and meshing it into one little overture. And put together this rather humorous biography of PDQ Bach. Well, Hoffnung comes at least a decade before. And he would do these spoofs and put on these Hoffnung festivals. And he would bring in several conductors. He wouldn't conduct himself. I believe he was a tuba player. And he would bring in the best orchestra, one of the best orchestras, London Philharmonic. And he wrote Leonore Overture No. 4. Now, some of the, I guess call them jokes, you'd have to be a musician who had played the overture really to get it. And one of them is the very beginning, with that fortissimo diminuendo piano. In his version, the orchestra stops, which is wonderful because you can't get any quieter than absolute silence. Even the audience doesn't really get that, but only if you look at the score will you see what he's doing. So I'm going to go through the list with you. This doesn't include everything, but these are the most important items to look out for. And if you have a watch and or a clock and you want to time them, I even put the times on the side. So number 1 I explained. Number 2, well, the trumpet comes in after 2 minutes, which is way too early. This is kind of a spoof of what could happen in an amateur orchestra. Rarely would this happen in a really good professional orchestra. But I've done some amateur orchestras as a substitute, and these type of things happen, that the trumpeter miscounts his measures, doesn't come in at the right place. Number 3, there's a series of chords. It's the same chord, and the orchestra gets stuck on that chord. And you'll have to visualize this. The conductor probably waving like crazy at the orchestra to change the chord, which finally it does only when he brings in a fortissimo from the brass section. Number 4, another wrong trumpet entry. This time it's a brass band, and I'm sure that this band wasn't on stage, but it was coming down the aisles. That's what it sounds like. And it, in the end, sounds like a Mardi Gras band. And if you listen carefully, you will hear people improvising on some of the themes from the real overture. Number 5, you've got these loud brass blasts, which you won't hear in the overture. We have another wrong trumpet entry. Then you have a wood block, can't do it, imitating a horse gallop at one point. We have a 4th wrong trumpet entry. Then suddenly the overture, which is in 4/4, for very briefly becomes a waltz. He throws in a waltz rhythm. And then, if you may recall, at the very end of the segment I played, there was this great rush in the orchestra, or the strings. There was this yum, and that's when you're supposed to hear the trumpet. Well, there's no trumpet. So the conductor has the orchestra play that crescendo rough passage all over again, still no trumpet. Then, finally, you come to that a moment where you get trumpets, but you get like 50 of them, and they must have been placed all over the auditorium, and he can't stop them. And then the very end, which is really very typical of amateur orchestras, the sort of ending or the coda is really treacherous string playing. And it starts with the first violins, have a very difficult passage, and it just takes one violinist and the whole section will be thrown off, which doesn't happen in this recording. But you have this whistle, which is sort of sounding off to the races we go, and you hear this very fast passage, then played by the seconds, the violas, the cello and basses together, and then the whole orchestra comes in. But I'm telling you, I've witnessed this When one violinist goes off in the first, it throws off everybody else. Everyone comes in wrong and messes up their notes, which he should have added to this because it would have made it even more amusing. So anyway, I hope this will work. Here we have Leonore Overture number 4. Well, my apologies. I had to get that out of my system. Always wanted to do that. Just an example of what could go wrong during a performance, and it has happened before. So that's it for Fidelio. In 2 weeks, we're going to honor a woman, a musician, composer, pianist. It's National Women's Month, and that will be Cécile Chaminade. Kind of forgotten today. Not a great virtuoso, but a very, very popular pianist who wrote a ton of music. And we hear occasionally a piece by her. Rather small scale works for the piano, very melodic. She lived a long time. Not a lot known about her, but it's kind of nice to remember her. As I said, she was very popular in her day. So, if there are any questions,